I need to start by explaining what deep-sea salvage actually is, because most people get it wrong in a way that feels harmless until you understand the consequences. They picture treasure, sunken gold, old ships waiting to be cracked open and looted like abandoned safes. That idea survives because it keeps people calm. It turns the ocean into a vault instead of what it really is, which is a place where mistakes do not decay. They wait. Salvage is not about finding things. It is about retrieving what failed. Wrecked vessels, lost research platforms, black boxes that recorded the last few seconds before something went silent. We go down after engineers swear everything was calculated, after insurers sign off on impossibilities, after press releases use words like unforeseen and catastrophic. We go where pressure is no longer a number but a physical law you feel pressing against your thoughts. I've been a deep-sea salvage operator for 12 years, long enough that the work no longer feels dangerous in the way it did at the beginning, long enough that fear has been replaced by routine, which is worse. I operate out of a privately chartered vessel that does not carry a name on its hull, only a registration code that changes depending on which agency is paying that month. We work under layered classification contracts, civilian on the surface, military once submerged, off-record entirely below certain depths. Every job begins the same way. Briefing room, fluorescent lights, a stack of documents already waiting at my seat, technical schematics, environmental forecasts, liability waivers written in language designed to make responsibility evaporate, and then the rule sheet. The rule sheet is always separate, printed on thicker paper, no letterhead, no logos, just numbered lines. Most of it is dull. Pressure thresholds, tether protocols, recording limitations. What to do if communications drop for longer than a specified window. Things you follow because not following them gets you killed in obvious ways. One rule is never dull. It is always highlighted, not in color but by repetition. The mission coordinator reads it out loud. The safety officer reads it again. We initial next to it separately, even though our signatures already appear at the end of the document. Do not breach, cut into, or otherwise compromise any hull that appears structurally intact. It does not say vessel, it says hull. That distinction matters later. The first few years I assumed it was about pressure safety. That is what they want you to assume. An intact hull at depth is dangerous. Breaching it incorrectly can cause rapid implosion, unpredictable shockwaves, secondary collapses. Physics does not forgive curiosity. I accepted the rule the same way I accepted all the others, with professional distance. My third descent changed that. By then I had already seen what pressure does to metal. Ships do not sink gracefully. They fold. They tear. Seams split like old fabric. Decks compress into each other. Windows cave inward and leave jagged scars where they used to be. Even reinforced research subs eventually fail. Nothing sealed stays sealed forever. So when something stays whole, it stands out. On that third job, we were contracted to survey a cargo vessel lost decades earlier, supposedly due to structural failure during a storm. The coordinates placed it well below what that class of ship should have survived, even briefly. It should have been debris, a smear of steel and sediment. Instead, our lights found it upright. The hull was intact, not preserved, intact. Paint still clung to the metal in places where corrosion should have eaten through years ago. The name was readable, not clean but legible. No implosion damage, no outward rupture. It looked less like a wreck and more like something set down carefully and forgotten. The rule officer on that dive did not joke. He did not explain. He simply told us to maintain distance and log visuals only. No attachments, no contact, no acoustic probing. The job classification changed while we were still descending. That happened sometimes, but never that fast. I remember hovering there, watching the hull reflect our lights in a way that felt wrong. Light did not scatter. It dulled, like it was being absorbed rather than bounced back. My instruments reported normal readings. My body did not agree. There was a pressure in my chest that had nothing to do with depth. We completed the survey and ascended without incident. Officially, the job was marked inconclusive. Unofficially, the footage vanished from my terminal 2 days later. When I asked about it, I was told the data had been reclassified. No explanation, no follow-up. A week after that, the rule sheet changed. The wording stayed the same, but the emphasis did not. The rule about unbroken hulls was moved higher. It was no longer buried among technical procedures. It sat alone, separated by white space, like a warning sign you were not meant to read too closely. At the time, I still believed it was about safety, about pressure and physics and liability. I told myself that intact wrecks were statistical anomalies and nothing more, rare but explainable. I told myself the rule existed to keep people alive. I believed that until I learned how many intact hulls there really were, and how many people never came back after deciding one rule did not apply to them. Outsiders think hull integrity is a number you read off a screen, a percentage, a green bar that turns yellow and then red. That belief survives because it feels scientific, and science makes people comfortable. At depth, sensors lie. They lie because they are built by people who still think pressure is something you can fully model. Steel fatigue, microfractures, stress distribution, all of that matters, but none of it tells you what a wreck feels like when you see it with your own eyes. Real salvage assessment starts visually, always has. Cameras before contact. Light sweeps slow and deliberate, never direct at first. You look for asymmetry. You look for collapse points. You look for the subtle inward bowing that tells you the ocean won a long time ago. Most wrecks are honest. They fail the way physics predicts. Hulls buckle inward like crushed cans. Decks fold. Bulkheads shear. Even when a ship goes down intact initially, time finishes the job. Pressure does not need violence. It just waits. Seams weaken. Metal creeps. Eventually something gives, and when it does, the whole structure follows. That is why intact hulls do not exist past certain depths. There are thresholds every salvage operator knows by heart. Past them, survival time for sealed structures drops from hours to seconds. No amount of reinforcement changes that. Military subs implode. Research vessels flatten. Pressure does not negotiate. So when a hull stays whole, it is not impressive. It is wrong. The first unbroken hull I ever saw clearly was a freighter, civilian class, old, nothing special on paper. It had vanished decades earlier during a storm that should not have been fatal. The coordinates put it well below the survivable range for its design. We expected debris. Instead, our lights found a ship resting upright on the seabed, as if it had been parked there. The bow was slightly embedded in sediment, but not from impact. It looked like it had settled. The superstructure was intact, railings bent but unbroken, windows dark but unshattered. The paint was faded but present. Even the nameplate was readable through the growth. No implosion scars, no outward ruptures, no torn seams. It should not have been possible. I remember one of the crew laughing over comms, calling it a museum piece. Another joked about selling tickets if we could get it back to the surface. That kind of humor is common down there. You joke because the alternative is thinking too hard. The rule officer did not laugh. He did not correct them either. He just went quiet. Silence from a rule officer is never accidental. Their entire job is to talk, to remind, to reinforce, to narrate procedure so it becomes automatic. When they stop speaking, it means they are listening to something you are not cleared to hear. Our lights traced the hull slowly. The longer we looked, the stranger it felt. Not threatening, not overtly dangerous, just deliberate, like the ship had chosen its posture. Sensor data streamed in, and it was nonsense. Internal volume readings did not match external dimensions. Stress sensors reported stability where collapse should have been inevitable. Temperature gradients were wrong, too uniform, too calm. That is when the classification changed. Mid-dive reclassification is rare. It requires approval from someone not on the ship, someone watching the same feed we were. The update came through as a simple code change, but the rule officer stiffened when it appeared. Observe only. No attachment. No logging beyond visual confirmation. Do not record audio. That last instruction was not on the rule sheet. It came verbally, clipped and precise. I remember feeling irritation more than fear. We were professionals. We were there to work. Being told to just look felt like an insult, but we complied because that is what keeps you employed. As we hovered there, something became clear that no sensor would ever register. The ship did not look abandoned. There was no sense of collapse frozen in time. No chaos halted mid-failure. Everything was ordered, doors closed, cargo holds sealed, antennas bent but aligned. Even the sediment around the hull looked disturbed in a pattern that suggested movement, not impact. It looked placed. That is the word I keep coming back to. Not sunk, not crashed, placed. Our lights glided across the name again, and for a moment I thought I saw movement behind one of the bridge windows. Just a shift, a change in darkness. I told myself it was particulate matter, marine snow, anything but what my instincts suggested. I glanced at the rule officer's feed. His camera angle had pulled back slightly, as if distance itself were a form of compliance. When we finally ascended, no one spoke for a long time. Jokes dried up. The freighter vanished into black as our lights lost reach, and I felt something like relief when it did. Back on the surface, the debrief was short, too short. The footage was flagged, the data sealed. We were told the wreck did not meet recovery criteria and that no further action was required. The report I filed was returned to me the next morning, with half the fields removed. That was the first time I understood that unbroken hull was not a description. It was a category. And once something fell into it, the rules stopped being about what we could do. They became about what we were absolutely not allowed to disturb. The first time the rule was ignored did not happen on my watch. That is the only reason I am still here to talk about it. It happened months before the freighter. Different crew, different vessel, same depth class. They were contracted to retrieve black box data from a research sub that vanished during a trench mapping operation. Officially, it was listed as a catastrophic implosion event. Loss of pressure integrity, instantaneous failure, no survivors expected. The coordinates put it far below crush depth. That alone should have made recovery theoretical at best. Most imploded subs do not leave anything recognizable. You find fragments, curved scraps of metal, instrument housings torn open like fruit skins, data cores flattened beyond recovery. That is normal. What they found was not. The sub was resting on the seabed, slightly tilted, nose down. The hull was pristine. No fractures, no collapsed sections, no implosion scars. The viewport was intact. Even the external manipulators were folded neatly against the frame as if stowed. The crew reported confusion almost immediately. Their sensors insisted the hull was sealed. Internal pressure readings did not match the surrounding environment. Life support systems were offline but not destroyed. Frozen. Paused. The rule officer on that dive issued the standard instruction. Observe only. No breach. No cuts. They argued. That detail does not appear in any official report, but it shows up in the audio fragments that survived. You can hear it in the pauses between breaths. The irritation, the logic being applied where fear should have taken precedence. They convinced themselves that the rule was written for ships, not subs, that this was a recovery, not a salvage, that the black box was their priority and time was against them. They cut an access panel. The first sound on the recording is not rushing water. That is what everyone expects, the scream of pressure equalizing, the violent collapse inward, but that is not what happened. Instead, there is a low metallic groan, not tearing, not snapping, bending. The hull flexes outward. You can hear it clearly, steel protesting as something inside pushes back against the cut. The sound is wrong in a way that is hard to explain unless you have spent years listening to metal fail. It is not a failure sound. It is resistance. Then the pressure alarm triggers, not external pressure, internal. The numbers spike in the wrong direction. There is shouting. Someone swears. Another voice says something about sensors malfunctioning. Then there is a single, sharp impact from inside the hull, right where they cut. It sounds like a fist. That is not my interpretation. That is the word used by the technician who reviewed the audio before it was classified. A fist. A solid, deliberate strike. The access panel deforms, not inward, outward. The cut edges peel back as if pried. The last clear sound is metal tearing along a seam that should not have been under stress. After that, the audio dissolves into interference and static punctuated by brief, rhythmic impacts, like knocking, fast, panicked. Then silence. No bodies were recovered. No debris field was found. The research sub did not implode. It did not collapse. It vanished from the seabed entirely. The coordinates were scrubbed from public charts within a week. The footage from that dive is sealed under multiple layers of classification. Even within salvage circles, only fragments circulate. A few seconds of distorted audio. A single still frame that shows the hull moments before breach, smooth and untouched. The cruise vessel returned to port without them. Officially, it was listed as a loss due to mechanical failure during recovery operations. Quiet language, no headlines. The ship was decommissioned within the month, not sold, not repurposed, scrapped. At the time, I heard about it the way you hear about most things in this line of work. Through rumors, through clipped conversations that stop when you enter the room, through a rule sheet update that adds emphasis without explanation. I did not connect it to my own experiences then. That is another uncomfortable truth. When something does not happen to you directly, it feels theoretical, tragic, but distant. A cautionary tale you acknowledge and then file away so you can keep working. I remember someone saying the crew must have made a mistake, cut too deep, misread pressure gradients. Human error is a comforting explanation. It keeps the universe predictable. I told myself the same thing. It was easier than accepting that the rule existed, because something inside that sub did not want to be opened. And that breaking the hull was not what killed them. It was what let whatever was inside decide it no longer needed one. Our next contract took us deeper than anything I had signed for before. The depth alone should have been disqualifying. There are lines most salvage operators never cross, not because they are forbidden, but because the return on risk collapses past a certain point. Recovery becomes observation. Observation becomes documentation. Documentation becomes proof that something is gone for good. This job skipped all of that. The coordinates dropped us into a trench-adjacent basin that did not appear on civilian charts. The briefing avoided naming it directly. Instead, it used a phrase everyone in salvage understands even if no one defines it out loud. The quiet zone. Descent felt normal at first, controlled, familiar. The subsystems hummed with the steady reassurance of engineering doing what it was designed to do. Pressure readings climbed smoothly. External cameras showed the slow fade from blue to black as sunlight surrendered. Then things began to stretch. Sonar returns started coming back delayed, not by milliseconds but by whole seconds. At first we blamed calibration, then interference. Then we stopped guessing and simply noted the anomaly. Objects appeared farther away than they should have been. Distances elongated. Shapes lagged behind their echoes. Water movement slowed. Not stopped, slowed. Particulate matter drifted past our lights as if moving through something thicker than water. Marine snow fell in lazy spirals that should have been carried sideways by microcurrents that simply were not there. The ocean felt heavy. Pressure is usually something you feel in your ears, in your joints, in the tightness of your suit. This was different. There was a weight inside my chest that had nothing to do with compression. Breathing felt manual, like my body needed reminding to do it. Every inhale lagged a fraction of a second behind intention. Communication started to slip. We would speak, and our own voices would come back to us delayed, distorted slightly, like a bad echo in a concrete room. Surface control acknowledged our status updates late. Not enough to trigger abort protocols, but enough to be noticed. Enough to be logged. The rule officer began making handwritten notes. That alone raised my tension. Rule officers log digitally. Handwriting means something you do not want time-stamped. As we crossed a certain depth, the last signs of life vanished. No fish, no drifting organisms, no bioluminescent flashes in the dark. Even bacteria counts dropped to near zero. It was not a dead zone in the environmental sense. It was an absence, a hollow. Wrecks, however, were everywhere. Sonar painted outlines in the dark, too many. Ships overlapping ships, subs nestled near freighters, research platforms tilted against cargo vessels. They were not piled chaotically. They were spaced, arranged with just enough distance between them to avoid contact. Every single one of them registered as intact. Not pristine, not undamaged, but whole, hulls unbreached, structures complete. No debris fields radiating outward, no sign of implosion collapse. The quiet zone earns its name because sound behaves strangely there. Engines hum softer, vibrations dampen, even the subtle creaks of the sub's frame fade as if absorbed. You stop hearing the ocean pressing in. You stop hearing anything at all. That is when the rule officer spoke. He instructed us to stop recording external audio. No explanation, no discussion, just a directive. We complied immediately. Disabling audio capture felt wrong. Sound is a safety net. It tells you when metal is stressed, when pressure shifts, when something moves where it should not. Turning it off felt like closing your eyes in a dangerous room. But no one questioned it. We moved deeper and the wrecks grew denser. Our lights swept across hulls that should have been rusted through decades ago. Nameplates, identification numbers, faded insignias from different nations, different eras, all resting in the same silent basin. I realized then that this was not coincidence. Ships do not sink in clusters like this by accident. They scatter, they drift, they break apart. What we were seeing was accumulation. Containment. The sensation in my chest intensified the longer we stayed. It felt like pressure pushing outward now, like my ribs were resisting expansion rather than compression. My thoughts slowed, not panicked, focused too tightly as if narrowed. I caught myself staring at one particular hull longer than necessary. A research vessel with intact observation windows. The glass was dark but reflective. For a moment, I thought I saw our own lights moving inside it, mirrored in a way that did not make sense. I looked away. The rule officer's camera feed showed him rigid, posture locked. He was not scanning wrecks. He was watching the space between them. That was when I understood something I had never been told. The quiet zone was not quiet because nothing lived there. It was quiet because nothing moved unless it was sealed. We held position longer than protocol recommended. Surface control did not push us to ascend. They did not ask questions. They simply let us sit there, suspended in that thick silence, surrounded by intact hulls that should not have existed. When we finally adjusted course, our lights passed over a structure larger than the others, too large for classification. Its outline blurred at the edges, as if sonar refused to define it properly. The rule officer did not look at it. He simply marked our time and prepared ascent procedures without being told. We left the quiet zone slowly, reluctantly, like the water itself resisted letting us go. As depth decreased, sound returned in fragments. The sub creaked again. Particulate matter drifted faster. The weight in my chest eased, but it did not disappear. Back on the surface, the debrief was shorter than usual. No one mentioned the wreck density. No one mentioned the absence of life. The only thing emphasized was the rule we had already signed. Do not breach unbroken hulls. I understood then that the rule was not about safety during descent. It was about what waited patiently in places where pressure alone should have destroyed everything. And why silence was the only acceptable response once you entered its territory. We found it resting on a sediment shelf just beyond the densest cluster of wrecks. At first, it did not register as unusual. The outline was large, rectangular, familiar in the way military vessels are when stripped of markings by distance and darkness. Then the identification ping came back, and everything in the cabin shifted. The ship was a military transport officially listed as destroyed more than 40 years ago. Not lost, not missing, destroyed. The report stated catastrophic failure during a classified exercise. No wreckage recovered. No recovery attempted. Case closed. Seeing it on the seabed should not have been possible. Seeing it intact should have been impossible. There was no corrosion. Not minimal, not slowed. None. The whole surface looked matte and dull, not rusted. Edges were crisp where decades of pressure and salt should have softened them. There were no collapse points along the spine, no inward bowing, no stress fractures spidering along the seams. The windows were intact. That detail stuck with me more than anything else. Observation ports do not survive. Glass is always the first thing to go. It shatters, caves inward, leaves empty sockets that look like torn eye holes. These windows were dark but whole, reflective, watching us. Then one of them brightened. Not suddenly, gradually. A faint internal glow bloomed behind the glass, dim and steady. There was no registered power source, no active systems, no heat signature that matched operational lighting. It was just there, like a memory of illumination refusing to fade. My first instinct was to turn away. Not fear exactly, something closer to revulsion. The kind of reaction you have when you realize you are too close to something private, something that should not be observed. I wanted distance. I wanted darkness between us and that ship. Professional curiosity overrode it. That is the flaw Salvage relies on. The need to understand, to document, to get closer for a better look. I adjusted our lights, careful not to flood the windows directly. Indirect illumination only, sweeping across the hull. The light did not behave normally. Instead of scattering, it dulled. The beam seemed to sink into the metal rather than bounce back. Edges blurred slightly, as if the hull absorbed illumination instead of reflecting it. My instruments insisted everything was fine. My eyes disagreed. Cameras picked up movement inside. At first it was subtle, a shift of shadow, a change in contrast behind one of the forward windows. We enhanced the feed, slowed it down. The motion was deliberate, not drifting particulate, not equipment sway. Something moved from one compartment to another. Life sign sensors reported nothing. No heat spikes, no carbon traces, no electrical activity consistent with biological systems. Whatever was moving did not register as alive. The rule officer leaned forward in his harness. He did not raise his voice. He did not issue commands quickly. Instead, he spoke slowly, each word measured as if pace itself mattered. Do not attach. Do not enter. Do not strike the hull. The protocol was repeated in full, not summarized, not abbreviated. The way you speak to someone when you need them to remember something later. I hovered us at a respectful distance, though no distance felt sufficient. The internal light shifted again, traveling deeper into the ship. I had the sudden, irrational impression that it was moving away from our gaze, not toward it. A low vibration traveled through our frame. Not sound. We were not recording audio. This was physical, a subtle tremor that passed through the substructure like a breath. The pressure in my chest returned, sharper now, accompanied by a sensation of expansion, as if something inside me was pushing outward in sympathy. The hull's surface rippled. Not visibly, not in a way you could point to and say it moved, but the reflection changed, like a disturbance passing under thick ice. The light we cast bent, distorted briefly, then settled. The cameras caught it. Frame by frame playback confirmed it. The hull had flexed. Outward. That should not happen. The rule officer's hands tightened on his restraints. His breathing slowed. He did not look away from the feed, but his eyes flicked constantly between the hull and our position relative to it. I realized then that he was not worried about us touching the ship. He was worried about the ship touching us. Another internal light came on, then another. They did not illuminate compartments the way human lighting does. They marked presence, points of attention. They clustered briefly near one window, then dispersed, as if something inside was learning the shape of our vessel. I pulled back without being told. Distance increased. The sensation in my chest eased slightly, but not enough. The lights inside the transport dimmed in response, following us for a moment before stabilizing. The rule officer nodded once. We logged visuals only. No notes, no interpretation, just confirmation of existence. As we adjusted course to leave, one of the internal lights flared brighter than the others, briefly illuminating the inside of the window. I saw no crew, no bodies, no equipment in disarray, no signs of damage or emergency. What I saw instead was space. The interior looked deeper than it should have been. The far wall did not align with the hull's external dimensions. The light faded before I could make sense of it, leaving only darkness and reflection. We did not stay longer. As we moved away, the ship remained perfectly still. It did not pursue. It did not signal. It simply rested on its shelf, intact and waiting, lights dimming one by one as our illumination withdrew. I realized something then that unsettled me more than the movement or the light. The vessel did not behave like a wreck. It behaved like something dormant that had been disturbed. And the rules were not there to protect us from damaging it. They were there to prevent us from waking it fully, or giving it a reason to decide that containment was no longer necessary. Pressure is supposed to be simple. That is the lie everyone starts with. Pressure equals depth. Depth equals force. Force crushes anything sealed if it exceeds design limits. That equation is drilled into you until it becomes instinct. You trust it the way you trust gravity. At the depth we were operating, nothing sealed should survive compromise for more than a fraction of a second. Not ships, not subs, not reinforced military transports built with margins measured in optimism. If a hull fractures down there, the ocean does not rush in. It annihilates. It collapses space itself inside the structure. That is what implosion really is. Instantaneous failure. No resistance. No warning. What we were seeing violated that. The intact vessels in the quiet zone were not just whole. They behaved as if the pressure differential favored them, as if the ocean was something pressing against a boundary that refused to give. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation. Exotic alloys, experimental reinforcement, some classified structural technology that never made it into public documentation. That explanation held until we watched the hull move. It started as a dent, a shallow deformation on the transport side, near one of the sealed access points, barely visible. The kind of imperfection you would normally attribute to old impact damage, except this one formed while we were watching. The metal bowed inward slightly, then paused. For a moment, I thought pressure had finally won, that the hull was about to fail the way it should have decades ago. I prepared myself for implosion shockwaves, for emergency ascent protocols. Instead, the dent reversed. The metal smoothed itself out, slowly, deliberately. The surface returned to its original shape as if elasticity were being applied from the inside, not spring tension, control. It happened again. Another small deformation, another correction. The hull did not fight pressure like steel does. It responded. The sonar technician's voice was tight when he reported internal readings. He kept rechecking, recalibrating, insisting the system had to be wrong. Internal chambers were registering larger than the ship's external dimensions allowed. Not by much, a few meters here, a few there, enough to break geometry, not enough to dismiss as sensor noise. Compartments overlapping where they could not physically exist. Volumes that suggested space folded inward without changing the outer shape. Pressure does not create space. Pressure removes it. I watched the technician's hands shake as he adjusted settings. His screen showed outlines that refused to line up, internal maps sliding against each other like misaligned transparencies. Then we felt the vibration. It was not sound. We were not recording audio. It was physical, transmitted through the sub's frame, a low oscillation that did not rattle instruments or trigger alarms. It passed through us the way a distant tremor passes through bedrock. The frequency did not match any mechanical source we knew, too steady for structural stress, too precise for random movement. It was patterned. Intentional. The vibration pulsed in intervals, not evenly spaced, not rhythmic in a way that suggested machinery, more like signaling, like something testing resonance, seeing what would respond. The pressure in my chest tightened in sync with it, not painfully, uncomfortably. I felt expanded again, like my ribcage was resisting outward force. My breathing slowed without conscious effort, matching the pulse. I realized then that pressure was not acting on the hull the way it acts on everything else. Pressure was being managed. The rule officer reached up and disconnected his mic. No announcement, no explanation. He simply unplugged it and let it hang loose. Then he pulled out a pen and began writing on the physical copy of the rule sheet secured to his console. Handwriting again. His eyes never left the external feed. I wanted to ask what he was writing. I wanted to ask if he felt the vibration too, if he noticed the hull correcting itself, if he understood what the sonar readings meant. I did not speak. Something about the vibration made speech feel intrusive, like noise in a room where something was concentrating. Another dent formed, smaller this time, near the window that had glowed earlier. The metal flexed, corrected, then held steady. The hull's surface looked smooth again, but the reflection had changed subtly, like skin after a muscle shifts underneath. The vibration intensified for a moment, then faded. When it stopped, the silence felt heavier than before. The sonar technician whispered that the internal chambers had stabilized. Whatever impossible geometry existed inside the ship had settled into a configuration the sensors could finally agree on. That was worse. It meant the inconsistency was not error. It was adjustment. The rule officer finished writing and folded the paper carefully, as if what he had just recorded needed to be preserved outside digital systems. He clipped it back into place and reconnected his mic. He did not comment on the vibration. He did not mention the hull movement. He simply reminded us of the protocol, slow and deliberate, as if repetition itself reinforced a boundary. Do not attach. Do not enter. Do not strike the hull. Pressure alone cannot explain something that resists correction. Pressure does not heal dents. Pressure does not create space where none should exist. And pressure does not signal. As we pulled back slightly, the hull remained perfectly smooth, perfectly intact. The vibration did not return. I had the unsettling realization that whatever was inside that vessel had finished learning what it needed to know, and that the rule officer's silence was not fear. It was acknowledgement. I did not realize at first how familiar the situation felt. That recognition came later, after we had left the quiet zone and the tension had settled into something colder. It came when I reviewed older files, not looking for answers but for reassurance. I wanted to prove to myself that what we had seen was new, an anomaly, a single event that could be isolated and contained. It was not new. I had seen these hulls before, just not with my own eyes. Salvage reports are living documents. They change as classifications shift, as liability moves, as responsibility is redistributed upward and outward until it disappears entirely. That is normal. Redactions happen. Sections are sealed. Technical language is softened. What is not normal is absence. There are gaps in the record that do not line up with any known incident. Missing pages, broken pagination, reports that reference attachments that do not exist, coordinates replaced with placeholders, depth readings rounded upward until they cross thresholds where recovery becomes theoretical instead of actionable. I had noticed it years ago and dismissed it as bureaucracy. Whenever a report mentioned an intact structure below certain depths, the language changed. Words like intact became structurally ambiguous. Unbreached became undetermined. Photographic evidence was summarized instead of included. Sensor data was described instead of attached. If a crew member raised questions, their name vanished from subsequent missions. Sometimes it was subtle, a reassignment to surface operations, a medical leave for stress-related symptoms, early retirement with generous compensation and strict non-disclosure clauses. Other times it was more abrupt, access revoked, clearance downgraded, their work history suddenly shorter than it had been the day before. At the time, I told myself it was coincidence. The industry is small, people burn out, pressure does things to the mind as well as the body. It was easier to accept that explanation than to consider intent. But there was one report I remembered clearly. Years before the freighter, before the quiet zone, before I understood what an unbroken hull really meant, I had been part of a survey mission on a collapsed oil platform. The structure itself was mangled beyond recognition, as expected. But beneath it, partially buried in sediment, our cameras had caught the edge of something smooth. A curved surface, metal intact. It was only visible for a few seconds before our lights moved on, but I noticed it. The shape did not match any known debris from the platform. It looked sealed, whole. The rule officer at the time dismissed it as shadow. We were there for the platform, not whatever lay beneath it. The job ended without incident. But the image stayed with me. When I reviewed the footage later, the frame where the object appeared was corrupted. Static where clarity should have been. I assumed it was a recording error. That assumption lasted until I checked the sensor logs and found corresponding data missing from the same timestamp. I filed a supplemental report. Nothing dramatic, just a note requesting clarification. A single paragraph asking whether the object warranted further survey. I attached the frame reference numbers and the partial sensor readings. The report was rejected. No reason given, no revision requested, just a notification that the submission did not meet criteria for inclusion. The next morning, the data was gone from my terminal. Not hidden, not reclassified, gone, as if it had never been there. I contacted technical support. They told me the files had been removed as part of routine archival. That explanation made no sense. Archival does not erase user access logs. It does not retroactively alter reports. That afternoon, I received an updated contract addendum. It was brief, 1 page, no introduction, no explanation, a single clause added under operational compliance. Do not breach or compromise any hull that appears structurally intact. It was in bold. At the time, I felt irritation more than fear. It felt like overreach, like someone correcting a mistake I did not think I had made. I signed it and moved on. Looking back, that was the moment I should have stopped. The pattern became clearer after the military transport. Once you know what to look for, absence is loud. Reports that should exist do not. Incidents that should have follow-ups end abruptly. Names appear once and never again. I realized that salvage operations had not just encountered intact hulls before. They had encountered them often. Often enough to justify a standing rule. Often enough to warrant silence. Often enough that an entire classification structure existed to keep those encounters from becoming a narrative. The rule was not added because of the research sub-incident. It was added because too many people had already ignored it. The people who complied stayed employed. The people who questioned it disappeared from the work. That is the quiet enforcement mechanism, not punishment, removal. I understood then why the rule officer wrote by hand, why audio was disabled, why visual logs were limited to confirmation only. Digital records can be copied. Paper can be controlled. Memory is harder to erase, but it fades on its own if reinforced by silence. I am not proud of how long it took me to accept that truth. I liked my work. I was good at it. I believed professionalism meant staying within defined boundaries and trusting that someone above me understood the larger picture. But standing in the quiet zone, surrounded by intact hulls that should not exist, watching a ship resist pressure like it was alive, I realized something important. The rule about unbroken hulls was not reactive. It was preventative. It existed because whatever was inside those vessels had been encountered before, studied briefly, and then deliberately avoided. And every missing log, every altered report, every reassigned crew member was part of a system designed to make sure no one ever asked the wrong question loudly enough to require an answer. The question I had almost asked years ago. The one I would not be able to ignore much longer. Contact happened without us ever touching the ship. That is the part that still unsettles me most. We were holding position at a distance that complied with every written protocol. No attachments deployed, no physical probes, no acoustic pings. Our external lights were angled wide, indirect, meant only to maintain situational awareness while we prepared to withdraw. It should have been passive. Instead, it was enough. One of the internal lights inside the transport shifted. Not brightened, not flickered, it rotated. The glow slid behind the window and reoriented, angling toward our sub as precisely as a spotlight finding a target. A second light followed, then a third. They did not illuminate the interior. They marked us. There was no confusion in their movement, no randomness. Whatever controlled them knew exactly where we were. My stomach tightened. I felt the same pressure in my chest again, stronger this time, accompanied by a strange sense of attention, not observation, focus. Then came the tapping. At first I thought it was interference, a sensor artifact, something brushing against the hull, but it repeated, spaced evenly enough to demand recognition. The vibration traveled through the water and struck our sub with a soft, hollow impact. Tap, tap, pause, tap, tap. It was not sound. We were not recording external audio. It was physical. Each contact registered as a faint tremor in the frame, subtle but unmistakable. The pattern was wrong. I knew that before I understood why. Years of salvage work condition you to recognize distress signals instinctively. There are formats burned into muscle memory. rhythms learned through repetition. This matched one of them. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but close enough that my breath caught when the realization landed. It was attempting a human distress pattern. The spacing was off, the emphasis wrong, but the structure was there, an echo of a signal designed to be recognized by people in sealed vessels, isolated and desperate for response. Tap, 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 longer pause, tap. The rule officer stiffened. His voice cut through the cabin, sharp and immediate. Disengage, ascend, now. No explanation followed, none was needed. I began pulling us back, increasing distance steadily but not abruptly. Sudden movement can be interpreted as threat. I did not know what interpretation mattered here, but instinct told me caution was still relevant. The tapping changed. It accelerated. The intervals shortened. The impacts grew slightly stronger, no longer tentative. It was no longer testing resonance. It was adjusting. Trying again. The lights inside the ship brightened, tracking our movement with unsettling precision. As we moved, they moved. Not lagging, not searching, following. I realized then that the lights were not illumination. They were orientation. The vibration patterns shifted again, this time aligning closer to a second format. Another human signaling convention. Emergency. Urgent. The kind used when time is critical and response is uncertain. Something inside that vessel was cycling through learned behaviors. It was not improvising. It was remembering. The pressure in my chest intensified until breathing felt shallow. Every instinct screamed to flee, but procedure demanded controlled ascent. Panic kills more reliably than pressure ever has. As distance increased, the tapping grew frantic. It lost structure. Rhythm broke down into rapid, uneven impacts that struck the hull wherever contact could be made. The vibrations rattled internal fixtures now, not violently, but insistently, like knocking on every surface at once. The rule officer did not repeat his command. He watched the feed, eyes unblinking, jaw set. His hands were clenched so tightly I could see the strain through his gloves. The lights inside the ship flared brighter, no longer contained to windows. Thin lines of illumination traced along seams in the hull, glowing faintly where metal met metal. Not leaks, pathways. As we backed away, I had the sudden, horrifying impression that the ship was not signaling for rescue. It was signaling recognition. It had noticed us, identified us as something familiar, something compatible. The tapping crescendoed into a continuous vibration that blurred individual impacts into a single, sustained tremor. The pattern was gone now. Whatever protocol it had been following was abandoned. Desperation had replaced mimicry. Then, abruptly, the vibration stopped. The lights inside the ship dimmed slightly, stabilizing as if restraint had returned. We had reached the edge of visibility. Darkness crept in from the edges of our lights, swallowing detail, erasing shape. The internal lights followed us until the last possible moment. They did not fade randomly. They withdrew in sequence, maintaining alignment with our position until the final window slipped beyond our reach. The last light lingered longer than the others, fixed on us, before extinguishing completely. Blackness closed in. Silence returned, heavier than before. Only then did the pressure in my chest ease. We ascended without further incident. No pursuit, no final signal. The ship remained where it was, intact and waiting. Back on the surface, no one spoke for several minutes. When the debrief finally came, the rule officer described the encounter in the most minimal terms possible. Visual confirmation, no contact, no anomalies requiring follow-up. The tapping was not mentioned. The lights were described as passive illumination artifacts. The distress pattern I recognized never appeared in any report. I signed the summary without comment. But that night, lying awake in my bunk, One thought kept repeating itself with sickening clarity. Whatever was inside that vessel had learned how to call for help. And the only reason it had stopped was because we had moved out of reach. Not because the attempt had failed, but because it now knew the distance required for containment. The voices started playing halfway through ascent. At first, I thought it was interference, residual noise bleeding back into the system after we re-enabled certain channels. That happens sometimes. Old data fragments surfacing when pressure changes shake loose corrupted buffers. Except this audio was clean. Distorted but intentional, filtered not damaged. A calm male voice filled the cabin, low and steady, speaking with the measured cadence of someone trained to be heard clearly under stress. Requesting assistance, coordinates follow. A pause, then numbers. Latitude, longitude, depth. The coordinates were wrong, not inaccurate, impossible. They referenced a location that no longer existed on any navigational chart, civilian or military. A place erased after an incident no one publicly acknowledged. Another voice followed, female, controlled, professional. Life support compromised. Hull integrity nominal. Repeat. Hull integrity nominal. That phrase made my stomach drop. Nominal. That is not something you say during a catastrophic failure. It is something you say when you want to reassure command that the structure holding you together is still doing its job. The timestamps attached to the audio made no sense. They predated our dive by decades. The rule officer froze. His eyes went to the playback display, then to me, then back again. For the first time since we had entered the quiet zone, I saw something crack through his composure. Recognition. The voices continued, cycling through short, composed messages, status updates, requests for guidance, calm acknowledgments of orders that were never given. None of it matched our mission logs. None of it had been recorded during our dive. These were not echoes. They were not ghosts in the machine. They were transmissions. I recognized one of the voices. That realization hit me harder than the rest. It was subtle at first, a familiarity in cadence, a specific way of enunciating technical terms. I had heard it before, not in person, but in a training video shown to new Salvage recruits, an archival briefing about emergency protocols during deep-sea research failures. The man speaking in the video had been declared dead 30 years earlier. His sub had supposedly imploded during a test dive. Total loss, no recovery. The footage ended with static and a somber voiceover explaining the dangers of experimental descent. But the voice in our cabin was calm, unhurried. Alive. I felt cold spread through me as the implication settled. These crews had not drowned. They had not been crushed. They had not been torn apart by pressure. They had been preserved. Maintained. The audio playback looped, then stopped abruptly. Silence flooded the cabin, thick and oppressive. My hands were shaking. I did not remember when they started. I turned to the rule officer. "What is this?" I asked. He did not answer immediately. He reached up and disabled the playback system entirely, powered it down. Then he exhaled slowly, like someone finally conceding something they had been holding back for years. "They don't die," he said quietly. The words hung there heavy. "Not the way you think." He looked at the darkened display, then at me. "Unbroken hulls aren't survivals," he continued. "They're containers." The words settled into place with terrible clarity. Containers. He explained then, not fully, not generously, but enough. Early encounters had been misinterpreted. Salvage crews assumed intact hulls meant failed implosions, pressure anomalies, rare edge cases. They tried recovery. They tried breach. What they found inside were not corpses. They were environments. Whatever occupied those vessels did not tolerate structural damage. Breach triggered response, not escape, transfer. The research subcrew had not been killed by pressure. They had been taken out of circulation, incorporated, their systems repurposed, their bodies used as stable frameworks in an environment where human engineering had already proven capable of resisting collapse. Pressure doesn't bother it, the rule officer said. It uses it. Pressure keeps everything where it belongs. I thought of the voices, calm, professional, still following protocol. They're still conscious, I said. He did not deny it. They're maintained at a functional level, he replied. Enough to operate, enough to communicate, enough to remember. I remembered the tapping, the distress patterns, the mimicry. They're being used, I said. He nodded once. Whatever's inside those hulls needs structure, sealed spaces, defined boundaries. Human vessels are ideal. When one fails intact, it becomes a candidate. And the crews, I said, are part of the structure, he finished. I felt sick. The idea that those voices were not recordings but active processes, still looping through procedures decades after their official deaths, was unbearable. They're calling for help, I said. Why let them do that? They're not calling for help, the rule officer said. They're signaling compatibility. They're bait. The word hit hard. The thing inside learns through them, he continued. It learns our standards, our signals, our expectations. It tries to attract sealed spaces with occupants, subs, ships, stations. I thought of the military transport, the lights, the internal space that did not fit. How many? I asked. He did not answer. That silence was answer enough. As we continued ascent, no more audio played. The systems remained quiet. The pressure in my chest lingered like a bruise. I realized then why the rule was absolute. Do not breach unbroken hulls. Because breaking them does not free the crew. It frees what has learned to keep them alive, just enough to be useful. The ocean did not kill those people. Something else found them first. And it was still listening. He told me the rest once we were far enough from the quiet zone that the instruments behaved like instruments again. There is a range where explanations are permitted, where acknowledgement does not automatically trigger protocol violations. We crossed it during ascent, somewhere between crushing silence and ordinary deep water. I did not know where that line was, only that he waited until we were past it. The first one, he said, was a mistake. He did not specify which one. He did not need to. In this context, first meant original, the initial intact wreck that triggered curiosity instead of caution. Early salvage operations were not governed by rules about unbroken hulls. Those rules did not exist yet. Back then, intact meant lucky, valuable, worth investigating. A sealed hull was a gift. It meant data, survivors, answers. They breached it. The ocean did not rush in. That detail was emphasized in every restricted testimony I was later allowed to hear. Every person who reviewed the footage remarked on it. They expected collapse. They braced for implosion shock. They got nothing. The water around the breach went still. Not calm, still, like motion itself had been arrested. Particulate matter froze in place. Pressure readings dropped, then reversed. Instruments screamed incoherently before going dark. Something came out. Not physically, not in a way cameras could cleanly record. The footage is difficult to watch because there is nothing obvious to focus on. No shape, no form, just an absence moving against expectation. The rescuing vessel did not rupture. That is what confused investigators the most. There was no external damage, no breach, no visible stress fractures. The hull remained intact all the way through the incident. Internally, everything failed. Bulkheads twisted out of alignment. Compartments shifted relative to each other. Doors opened into spaces that should not have existed. The internal layout of the ship lost cohesion, as if geometry itself had been loosened. Crew members were thrown against surfaces that were no longer where they had been moments earlier. Some were crushed without impact. Others vanished from camera view entirely, not dragged away, not ejected, just gone between frames. The vessel remained sealed. That was the worst part. No water intrusion, no flooding, no implosion, just internal rearrangement until nothing resembled a functional space meant for humans. The thing that emerged from the breached hull did not behave like a creature. It did not move with intent the way animals do. It did not pursue. It did not attack in any recognizable sense. It expanded into available structure, testing boundaries, adapting to containment. When it encountered sealed compartments, it occupied them. When it encountered people, it incorporated them. Pressure meant nothing to it. Silence meant nothing. Those were conditions it preferred. Containment was not a prison, it was a requirement. The breach released it into an environment that lacked sufficient structure, so it sought replacement. Ships, subs, anything sealed. The rescuing vessel became that replacement. By the time command realized what was happening, the internal configuration of the ship no longer matched its schematics. Rescue attempts failed because there was nowhere consistent to send help to. Compartments shifted between transmissions. Hatches led to voids. Eventually, the vessel went silent. Not destroyed, silent. Sonar later confirmed it resting intact on the seabed, hull unbroken, systems dormant. Another container added to the quiet zone. That footage never left secure archives. But the lesson did. Containment was possible as long as the hull remained intact. Breach triggered migration. Migration required structure. Structure was easiest to find where humans built it. That's why pressure doesn't kill it, the rule officer said. Pressure keeps it stable, keeps it from spreading. I thought of the tapping, the mimicry, the way it had tried to communicate using our standards. It learns, I said. He nodded. Every breach taught it something, what signals attract us, what shapes hold, what materials last, what kind of containment is mobile. And the crews, I said, the voices. Interfaces, he replied. They're already adapted to sealed environments. They know the language, the protocols, they're ideal. I felt a wave of nausea. So if a hull breaks, I said slowly, it looks for another. Yes. And if it finds one, I said, it doesn't destroy it. No, he said, it occupies it. I thought of the military transport, the internal space that was too large, the lights that marked attention instead of illumination. It was testing us, I said. Yes. To see if we were sealed enough, I said. Yes. The realization settled in my chest like a weight. The rule about unbroken hulls was not just about preventing release. It was about denying opportunity. As long as the containers remained intact and isolated, the thing inside them was constrained by its own requirements. Break the hull, and you give it options. And if one ever breaks on its own, I said. The rule officer did not answer immediately. That's why we monitor, he said finally. That's why salvage still happens. We're not recovering wrecks, we're checking locks. The image was too clear. Hundreds of sealed vessels resting in silence, each one holding something that had learned to use our engineering better than we ever intended. Each one waiting for failure, for stress, for corrosion, for opportunity. And if one reaches the surface, I said. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time I saw fear without restraint. It won't, he said. Not reassurance. Determination. Because if it does, he continued, it won't need us anymore. It will have learned everything it needs about sealed spaces. The ascent continued in silence after that. I stared at the depth readout, watching the numbers tick down, and wondered how many intact hulls lay below us, how many were already close to failure, and how many ships on the surface were sealed, occupied, and moving through the water without ever knowing what kind of structure they were becoming. People assume we keep taking these contracts because of money. Hazard pay, bonuses, classified work that pads retirement accounts and shortens careers. That explanation works for outsiders because it fits a familiar narrative. Dangerous jobs attract people willing to gamble. That is not why Salvage continues. If this were about profit, the work would have stopped years ago. Insurance companies would have walked away. Governments would have buried the evidence and let the ocean keep its secrets. It would have been cheaper. We keep going because the alternative is not absence. It is neglect. The hulls do not stay where they fall. That was the first thing I learned after the truth stopped being theoretical. Intact vessels do not remain static on the seabed. Over time, they migrate, slowly, incrementally, too subtly for casual observation, but enough to register if you know what you are looking for. They slide along sediment shelves, adjust their orientation, settle closer to slopes that lead upward instead of downward. They do not move like debris dragged by currents. They reposition. The quiet zone is not permanent, it shifts. Clusters form and dissolve over decades. Wrecks that were once isolated end up closer together. Others drift away, following gradients that make no sense from a geological standpoint. They are drawn to sealed spaces. Shipping lanes attract them. Not directly, not in ways that trigger alarms, but over time, intact hulls begin appearing closer to areas of frequent maritime traffic, research vessels, military exercises, submarine routes, anywhere humans repeatedly place sealed structures into the water. It is not hunger. It is opportunity. Monitoring is containment. That is the part no one says out loud, but it is the truth. Salvage crews are not sent down to retrieve wrecks anymore. Recovery is secondary and often forbidden. We are paid to confirm integrity, to make sure the hulls remain unbroken. Every job is an inspection disguised as a mission. We verify that corrosion has not advanced too far, that stress fractures are not forming outward, that no unauthorized breach has occurred, that nothing has changed since the last time someone checked. We document movement patterns quietly. Depth changes, orientation shifts, proximity to active routes. All of it feeds into models that predict where the next cluster might form. We do this without alerting the public. No headlines, no warnings, no changes to shipping routes that would invite questions. The ocean already swallows enough without explanation. Adding a new category of disappearance would destabilize systems that rely on predictability. Every intact wreck is a successful quarantine. That is not metaphor. As long as the hull holds, whatever is inside remains constrained by its own requirements. Pressure, silence, defined boundaries. The very conditions that make the deep ocean hostile to us make it stable for them. Breaking that balance is not an option. A breached hull is not a localized incident. It is not a spill you can contain with booms and press releases. It is an extinction-level scenario for whatever exists above it. Because once released, it does not spread randomly. It seeks structure. Sealed spaces are everywhere on the surface. Ships, submarines, offshore platforms, storage facilities, even cities, in a sense, are networks of contained environments layered inside larger ones. If it ever reached a place where containment was plentiful and pressure was optional, adaptation would accelerate. That is what the rule officer meant when he said it learns. Every intact hull is a lesson delayed. Every breach is a lesson taught too quickly. That is why crews like mine are tolerated, even valued. We are expendable enough to be sent down, experienced enough to recognize danger, and controlled enough to follow rules that make no sense unless you know what failure looks like. We are not heroes. We are custodians. I have heard people say the system is cruel, that keeping those crews alive inside containers is monstrous, that there must be another solution, a way to free them, a way to end it. There is not. Anything that breaches the hull gives it freedom of movement. Anything that collapses the structure gives it incentive to find another. The crews inside are not prisoners in the way people imagine. They are components now. Removing them would be like tearing wiring out of a live system and expecting it not to respond. That does not mean it is right. It means it is necessary. The public never hears about successful salvage missions, only failures, ships that vanish, subs that go silent, platforms lost to storms. The absence of intact hull reports is not evidence that nothing is there. It is evidence that the system is working. For now, I still take these contracts because someone has to, because the ocean does not forget, and sealed spaces keep appearing whether we want them to or not, because ignoring the problem does not make it go away. Every time I descend, I'm not thinking about treasure or recovery or career advancement. I am thinking about locks, about seals, about how thin the boundary really is between containment and release, and about how many intact hulls lie below us, slowly shifting, waiting for corrosion or stress or one careless decision to give them what they need. We are paid to make sure that day does not come. Because if it does, whatever is above the watcher will not have time to understand what went wrong. There will be no warning, no pressure wave, no collapse, just a sudden redefinition of what counts as a sealed space, and whether we are still inside one when it decides to move. There is a final rule. It is never printed, never highlighted, never signed. It is not included in the rule sheet, no matter how thick the paper or how many revisions get stapled to it. You do not read it in a briefing room under fluorescent lights. You do not acknowledge it in writing. You hear it once, always from someone who has already survived long enough to understand why saying it twice would be dangerous. It is spoken quietly, usually after a successful job, when tension has drained just enough to let truth surface. It is framed as advice, not instruction, because instructions imply choice. This one does not. If you ever find an unbroken hull with damage forming outward, you leave. You do not report it. You do not mark the coordinates. You do not attempt reinforcement. You do not watch. You leave the area immediately and do not look back. Because outward damage means the hull is no longer failing. It is being discarded. Most people misunderstand stress fractures. They imagine cracks forming inward as pressure crushes a structure. That is how wrecks die. The ocean pushes, metal yields, space collapses. Outward fractures are different. Outward fractures mean pressure is no longer the dominant force. They mean something inside is pushing back, testing limits, deciding whether the container is still useful. They mean the hull has served its purpose. I learned that rule late. Later than I should have. Our last job was routine on paper. Survey and integrity confirmation on a wreck that had drifted closer to an active shipping corridor than projections allowed. A decommissioned research vessel, lost years earlier, officially written off as imploded beyond recovery. The descent was uneventful. No quiet zone classification. No immediate anomalies. Just the familiar weight of depth and the hum of systems doing what they were built to do. When we found the vessel, it was intact. Not pristine, but whole. The hull rested at a slight angle, partially embedded in sediment. Corrosion was minimal, seams held, windows dark. An unbroken hull. The rule officer began standard procedure. Visual sweep, distance maintained, no attachments. Then I saw it. A hairline fracture near the stern, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. A thin, pale line spidering away from a structural seam. Outward. I adjusted the camera angle, increased magnification slightly. The fracture was not jagged. It was smooth, almost polished, like a stress line formed slowly under controlled force. I felt the pressure in my chest return instantly, sharper than before. The sonar technician did not speak, but I saw his readings spike briefly, then stabilize. Internal pressure gradients were shifting in ways I had only seen once before, during footage I was never supposed to watch. The hull flexed. Not dramatically, just enough to confirm what my eyes already knew. The fracture widened by a fraction of a millimeter, then stopped. Outward damage. The rule officer saw it too. He did not say the words. He did not have to. His hand moved to disable audio recording without instruction. His other hand tightened on the harness strap, knuckles whitening. For a moment, protocol fought instinct. Years of conditioning screamed to document, to log, to report anomalies before withdrawal. But the unwritten rule carried more weight than any printed one. We left. No marker buoy, no final scan, no attempt to assess progression. I reversed course slowly at first, then increased speed once distance gave permission. The hull remained in view for only a few seconds more. In those seconds, the fracture spread. Not quickly, not violently. It traced outward in branching lines like veins emerging beneath skin. The metal did not tear. It separated cleanly, as if opening along predetermined paths. The hull was not breaking. It was opening. I turned away before anything else could happen. As we ascended, no tapping followed, no lights activated, no mimicry, no signals. That silence was worse, because it meant whatever was inside did not need to call for anything anymore. On the surface, the debrief was the shortest I have ever experienced. The wreck was categorized as unstable, no follow-up scheduled. The coordinates were downgraded and buried under rounded depth data that made recovery impractical. Officially, the vessel no longer existed as a point of interest. Unofficially, it had been crossed off a different kind of list. I did not sleep that night. I kept seeing the fracture in my mind, replaying the way it spread outward, controlled and deliberate. I understood then what the final rule really meant. An intact hull is containment. A failing hull is risk. But a hull that begins to break outward is intent. It means the thing inside has decided the ocean is no longer the optimal environment. That pressure and silence have served their purpose. That enough has been learned. It means it is preparing to move. Where it goes next is not random. It will seek a new sealed space with better mobility, better access, less pressure, more options. Something closer to the surface. Something that moves. That is why you do not report outward fractures. Reporting triggers observation. Observation triggers interest. Interest leads to breach. And breach at that stage would not release something confined. It would interrupt a transition. The last rule exists because there is a moment when containment ends and migration begins. A moment when interference does more harm than ignorance. You are not supposed to witness that moment. If you do, it means you were already too close. I still take contracts. I still descend. But every time I see a hull now, I am not looking for cracks inward. I am looking for the opposite. For the smallest sign that the container is no longer sufficient. Because when that happens, the ocean is done being the problem. And whatever comes next will not need pressure or silence to survive. It will already know how to live inside the things we build to keep ourselves safe. And it will not bother waiting on the seabed once it understands that the surface is full of better structures. I am recording this now because the next contract crossed a line I did not think they would let it cross. The coordinates are near a continental shelf, shallow enough that sunlight still reaches the upper layers, close enough to shipping routes that civilian traffic passes overhead every day without knowing it. There is no exclusion zone, no rerouted lanes, no warning notices buried in maritime bulletins no one reads. On paper, it is a routine survey, integrity confirmation, visual only, no recovery authorized. I have seen the sonar preview. The hull is intact. For now, it rests at an angle that suggests recent movement, not impact, not collapse, adjustment. The sediment around it shows displacement patterns that do not match currents in the area. The ship should have scattered debris across kilometers if pressure had done its work. It did not. The brief says lost due to catastrophic pressure failure. That phrase appears so often it has lost meaning. It is the easiest explanation because it cannot be argued by anyone who was not there. Pressure leaves no witnesses. Pressure does not testify. But pressure leaves debris. When a hull implodes, something comes back up. Fragments, oil sheen, twisted metal, sonar ghosts that refuse to resolve cleanly. Even the deepest failures leave signatures. When nothing is recovered, when there is no debris field, when a vessel simply goes quiet and never reappears, that is not pressure. That is containment holding. I am breaking confidentiality because I do not believe the system is meant to hold forever. I have watched the patterns long enough to know they are accelerating. Hulls migrating faster, clustering closer to active routes, outward stress appearing sooner than projections allow, containers aging. And now, for the first time in my career, they have issued a contract this close to the surface without isolating the area. That means one of two things. Either they believe the hull will hold, or they believe that if it does not, it will no longer matter who knows. I want people to understand why ships disappear without debris, why submarines go silent without implosion signatures, why platforms are lost in calm seas with no distress calls. If you are ever told a vessel was lost to pressure but the hull was never recovered, it means the hull stayed whole. And that is the only thing keeping what is inside from surfacing. The ocean has been doing containment work for us for longer than our records admit. Pressure and silence are powerful allies. They keep things stable. They keep movement slow. They make sealed spaces rare and precious. The surface is the opposite. The surface is full of doors. Ships are sealed environments moving through open water. Submarines are mobile containment units. Offshore platforms are networks of enclosed spaces stacked vertically and horizontally. Even ports are collections of sealed compartments layered beside each other. We have built exactly the kind of world something like this would want to move into. I do not know if the thing inside these hulls understands us the way we understand threats. I do not know if it is hostile in any way that matters. I only know that it adapts, and that adaptation has direction. Every intact hull is a lesson in patience. Every breach is a shortcut. The reason salvage crews like mine are sent down instead of remote drones is not cost. It is judgment. Cameras record what they see. Humans notice what feels wrong before instruments agree. We are the early warning system. And this time, the warning feels late. The sonar preview shows microfractures along the hull's upper edge. Not critical yet, not outward, but close enough that I can imagine the next stage. Close enough that I can picture the metal deciding it has done enough. There is no protocol for what happens if one of these reaches the surface intact. No rule sheet covers that scenario. Because by then, rules would be irrelevant. I am not telling you this so you panic. Panic does nothing but create noise. Noise invites attention. I am telling you so that when the next disappearance happens, you understand what it means. When officials say a vessel was lost to pressure, ask where the wreckage is. When they say recovery was impossible, ask why sonar never found fragments. When they say there was no distress call, remember that distress calls require the sender to want rescue. Some signals are not requests. They are tests. If you hear about a ship vanishing near a shelf with no debris and no implosion signature, it means containment held long enough for something to decide where it wanted to go next. It means the hull stayed whole. For now, I will descend again soon. I will follow the rules that keep me alive. I will keep my distance. I will look for outward stress and turn away if I see it. But I do not believe turning away will always be enough. The ocean has limits. Pressure has limits. Containment always does. When those limits are reached, whatever has learned to live inside our sealed spaces will not rise violently. It will not announce itself. It will arrive quietly, already adapted, already structured, already inside something we trust to protect us. And when that happens, there will be no implosion, no debris, just a sudden understanding that the hull was never meant to be broken. It was meant to be opened somewhere safer, somewhere closer, somewhere we live.